Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. I'm Ian Bremmer. UBI, or Universal Basic Income, was the cornerstone of Andrew Yang's 2020 presidential campaign, and a concept not even his fellow Democrats were quick to embrace. What a difference a few months make. The White House has now begun sending out relief checks directly to taxpayers, and governments around the world are eyeing more permanent income solutions in the wake of this pandemic. So I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to check in with Andrew to see how some of his cornerstone campaign proposals are playing out in a post-coronavirus world. And here's our conversation. Andrew Yang, my friend, good to see you, man.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Ian. And thanks for the kind words. Certainly, no one wants to be proven right in a pandemic.
Exactly. Okay, let's jump into some policy, first of all. So let me ask you about UBI, because, of course, you've seen that the Spanish government announcing that they want to move forward with it. You've seen the Pope come out just the other day and saying we need universal basic income. I mean, the way that you thought about it, first of all, was $1,000 a month check for everyone. When you see what's been happening now, the number of people that are being thrown off the rolls, the unemployment level we have right now, how does it make you think? Does it change the nature of the universal basic income that you think is required? In terms of the urgency, in terms of the amount, in terms of how it's actually implemented? How's it changed your views?
It's reinforced my views in just about every respect, Ian. I thought we were in the midst of a slow-moving crisis before the pandemic. And what this pandemic has really done is it's accelerated trends that were already happening, where we were already seeing the Amazonification of our economy, the closing of brick and mortar retail, education heading more and more online. And now all of those trends have been revved up. I've been saying to people that it's like we're experiencing 10 years of change in 10 weeks. And so when I advocated for a $1,000 freedom dividend during my campaign, I thought we needed it immediately, but now the need is almost existential, because you have millions of Americans who are out of work. They have a very unclear future. A lot of the jobs that have disappeared are not going to come back. So we need to put this stimulus money into our hands, but then we need to make it monthly and ongoing throughout the crisis. In my view, it should extend beyond the crisis. And to the extent my thinking has changed, it's been in the amount, where I now think that an amount greater than $1,000 would be called for.
What do you, first of all, why would you say that? And secondly, what's the figure you're thinking about? How'd you come to that figure?
Well, the $1,000 a month was never going to be enough for most people to do more than maybe eke by very, very marginally. The thought process is that it would be a supplement on top of existing gig economy work and other forms of income. But now you've essentially turned the gig economy off in many industries. You've cut off any source of income to people. And so the levels that we're getting in the stimulus checks, I think, are appropriate. This $1,200 per adult, $500 per child. I wish it weren't means tested. And I also think that there are all these gaps in what we're doing with the stimulus checks right now, where there are many, let's call it 19 or 20-year-olds who are taken as dependents by their by their parents. So the 19 or 20-year-olds getting zero, and then the parents are also getting zero because the $500 only applies if you're 16 or younger. So I would have made it much, much more of a blanket, unconditional, no means testing, giving it to everyone. And I think that the amounts that they're looking at, where it's essentially somewhere between $1,200 and $1,800 per person, would be appropriate. So on a monthly basis.
I mean, so many things that we've said before we couldn't possibly do. We can't afford them. There's no way to pay for it. And we're now looking at a deficit that's probably going to be 20% of GDP or more this year. Not worried about what we can pay for. We've got this massive crisis. I'm kind of wondering, do you think we're just going to end up backing into a kind of UBI? Because everyone knows you can't stimulate the economy until you provide relief. And if you've got a large percentage of the workforce that's been kicked out of the workforce and isn't coming back for 3 months, for 6 months, for 12 months, for 18 months, I mean, at some level, you've got to keep providing these folks checks, right?
I think you're right, Ian. We're going to wind up at a universal basic income type reality. And we're probably going to back into it piecemeal. Like you have this stimulus bill, but they're already back at the table trying to figure out what the next stimulus could look like. So to me, it's vital that we don't stop with one payment, because the fact is this $1,200 isn't going to last people very long. The desperation is just going to continue into May. And even if parts of the economy reopen, we have to be realistic that you're going to see at best like a staggered climb back toward where we were. It's not going to come back immediately. So I agree with you. We're going to wind up either going forward into a universal basic income or slumping into it because Congress just keeps throwing logs on the fire. But to me, one of the bigger mistakes was that the bulk of the money that went into the stimulus bills don't go to people directly. They're getting fed through institutions. The fact is the states don't have the ability to process millions of new unemployment claims as quickly as you'd like. A lot of these banks are getting swamped through their small business payment protection application process that they also don't have the ability to process it quickly. Whereas if you put money into people's hands, it actually is pretty quick in the scheme of things, direct, it works, it's efficient. So I wish that more of the $2.2 trillion was in the straight stimulus check category as opposed to getting funneled through various state and banks institutional processes.
Well, one thing on the execution of this that I've always wondered about, you and I haven't talked about before, is, New York City is expensive, right? I mean, irrespective, not Manhattan, even Queens, doesn't matter. I mean, Staten Island, it's expensive. It is not like living in the middle of North Dakota. It's not like living in Nebraska. Any reason why we don't think about cost of living when we talk about UBI?
Well, when I was running, I thought that having it be geographically variable would be a bit of a disaster administratively, because the fact is, if someone was going to get paid more if they lived in a place like New York City, then I think there'd be a lot of people claiming New York addresses that might not actually live there in some way. So that was one argument against it in a period of calm. In a pandemic, it could be that you could make adjustments, but I think it would be politically impossible, just because you can imagine legislators from every part of the country. And then you can even imagine Chuck Schumer being like, hey, people in New York City should get more. I'm sure that would have been very difficult to pass.
Okay, let me ask you more broadly on the relief and bailout that we've seen so far. Which, in relatively short order, we had Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin, we had Speaker of the House Pelosi come together and get this bill done. How effective has it been? What, if anything, would you have changed so far?
I touched on it just now. I would have put much more money directly into people's hands because that's going to work. The other thing I would have done is I would have made the government the buyer. The problem really is that right now what we're saying is the government's going to put money into the hands of banks and states and then have it administered to various businesses. We were too slow. The fact is a lot of these businesses have already sent people home. And then if you go to that business and say, hey, if you apply and you keep people around, then we'll give you these forgivable loans. They're all thinking where were you 3-4 weeks ago when I was canning everybody? Like that. So
the restaurants, that's clearly already true, for example.
Yeah, for the restaurants, that's already true. And there's so many industries that have been affected. I'll give a random example from someone I know, dog walkers. It's like, if you had a dog walking business, your business went to zero, obviously. And so you don't think about that, but you imagine all of nail salons. You can just pretty much pick something out of a hat and they've fired people. So ideally, you would actually have the government say look, we'll pay directly. We're not going to try and funnel it through these hoses that are not designed to actually get money to this many people or this many small businesses this quickly. You could just come to the government, we'll pay the bill. So that would have been a much more effective way, because it would have had a greater ability to put our economy in suspended animation, if you will. It's like the government just picks up your rent checks, picks up your insurance bills, like whatever it is, we'll just like pick it up for this period, and then everyone just go home and cool out, unless you're obviously in an essential occupation, and then you can try and resuscitate the economy in 3 months time or 4 months time or whatever the period is. It could be obviously much longer than that. That would have been a much more effective approach than imagining our institutions are capable of doing things that they're not designed to do.
And when we start talking about stimulus and all of these larger companies that are also going to be sucking air for because consumer demand's been down and supply chain's been disrupted, as we give that money out, what kind of conditionality do you think about? I mean, this is taxpayer money at the end of the day. What should be required of the corporations that are the recipients of that cash?
You've probably seen some of the same reports I have, Ian, where there are private companies that are actually making a lot of money on this time, and in part because in many cases, the government's just shoveling money to them for airplane flights or protective equipment or whatever it is. This is going to be a trough that many companies unfortunately feed from. And when you're in a crisis, you're looking around and saying, well, it's like, well, I'm not going to try and nickel and dime you DuPont or FedEx or whatever the company happens to be. But you're going to see many of the most politically favored companies coming out of this shockingly healthy. And you're going to see other companies that aren't as well connected go to zero. So the unfortunate reality we're in the midst of right now is that the government's going to have an outsized say in our economy writ large, but also in the winners and losers of this crisis. And there is a real lack of accountability in terms of how this money gets spent. I wish that there was more oversight. And ideally, you would have much greater transparency and even bipartisan oversight panels to see to it that the bulk of the $2.2 trillion is spent wisely and that we're not getting gouged. Unfortunately, I do not think that's happening. That's one of the biggest holes in this stimulus plan if you want to think about efficient use of resources.
So let's turn to the election, where you've been being called on a lot for expertise recently. When you and I talked on air last, you said of all of the candidates, and there were many at that point, the one you'd be most willing to have a beer with, most like to have a beer with, was Joe Biden. He is now the nominee. And he has Bernie Sanders' endorsement, pretty quick out of the box for that one, has Barack Obama's endorsement, still doesn't have anywhere near the enthusiasm for his candidacy that Trump does for his base. How do you think about his campaign, especially given the challenges of running a campaign right now? What kind of messaging would you want him to be doing, given what we're looking at?
What I'd want Joe to do, and I'll be talking to him at some point in the not so distant future, so I'll tell him this. But if he watches this beforehand, great. Is that we have to let the American people know that this pandemic is going to cause damage that's going to be with us for years, and we need a new Marshall Plan scale initiative to rebuild the country. And to me, that should be the vision that Joe presents, saying it's not just enough that, look, I would administer the government effectively through this kind of crisis, but to recognize the fact that there are going to be scars that are deep and wide from this economic, psychological, cultural, and that we need to have this massive rebuilding effort that is going to span years and years. And this is what the rebuilding effort looks like. We're going to make investments in this. I mean, some of the obvious ones are the things that we've needed for years or decades, like and greater environmental sustainability, infrastructure, things that you could legitimately spend hundreds of billions of dollars on and create hundreds of thousands, even millions of jobs. That to me would be the vision that we should be presenting, because the danger is that this becomes just pure referendum on Trump. And I think that Trump's done a terrible job managing the coronavirus crisis, but there is a natural propensity for people to rally around the flag and rally around the leader in a time of crisis. And Joe has to make a positive case and present a bigger vision than I'm not Trump, let's go back to normal.
And when can he start doing that, right? Because, I mean, right now, of course, I mean, not only do we have these press conferences every day, but we're in the teeth of the crisis. We haven't turned the corner yet. People are still under lockdown. Can Biden start to deliver that message now? Or, I mean, does he really, realistically speaking, have to wait until we at least have the immediacy, the urgency of all of these people dying in the rearview mirror?
That's a great question, Ian. I personally do not think it is too soon to start presenting a positive vision of what we can do after this crisis, even in the depths of the crisis. Even right now, when I agree with you, to me, priority number one is just getting PPE into the hands of healthcare providers in Louisiana. Like, that's number one. And so focusing on that is 100% the right thing to do. But it's not too soon to start thinking about how we're going to actually rebuild after this crisis clears, whether that's, weeks, months from now, or even next year, after hopefully a vaccine gets developed. To me, that's one of the roles of the presidency, is to present a vision to the country that people can get excited about and passionate about.
So what about, I mean, on the actual handling of the election, given what you've seen already in Wisconsin just last week, I mean, we're clearly going to be engaging in some kind of social distancing still in November. What do you think about the vote by mail? How does that need to be handled? What do the Dems need to do right now to ensure that the mechanism for the campaign isn't subverted?
I am deeply concerned about how we're going to hold this election in November. And vote by mail needs to be a huge piece of the puzzle. Democrats need to be game planning as if we were having the election today or tomorrow. Like, you can't make rosy assumptions that we're all going to be able to go outside and congregate at polling places. One very obvious step, and I know you agree with me on this, Ian, Congress needs to be able to vote remotely on things first and foremost. Like, right now, can you imagine right now if you were a member of Congress and people are telling you that you're going to go back to DC next week, and you're like, okay, how am I going to get there? Because like public transit's not going to be that good. Maybe I'll have a plane row to myself or whatnot, but I'll have to go through airports and the rest of it. And then you get there, and then after you get there, you're supposed to convene in a giant auditorium with hundreds of people who came from all over the country via public transit.
It's not happening. Does
that make any sense to anyone? If you're a member of Congress, you're like, oh my gosh, is that really the plan? But there isn't an alternative plan insofar as voting remotely on legislation. Like, Congress is not set up like that. And this is not something you can solely blame the Republicans for. Both parties have resisted remote voting or being able to legislate from some place that's not the actual Capitol. So that's step one. And then step two is trying to plan for elections that will be handled remotely or by mail to some significant measure. Now, Republicans are going to naturally resist this. They're going to say it's ripe for fraud, which is somewhat disingenuous. I mean, there are things you can do to protect against fraud. And I think the main concern really is, as usual, politics. It's like, well, this would advantage people that vote one way more than another. So this is something that we need to be paying attention to right now, because November is going to creep up on us before we know it.
Andrew Yang, always good to see you, man.
Good to see you too, Ian. Stay safe, stay healthy. You look great.
Avoid people.
Yeah, exactly. Avoid people.
Absolutely.
What a time. What a time.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Like what you've heard? I hope so. Come check us out at gzeromedia.com and sign up for our newsletter, Signal.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.